The library in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, was bathed in the golden light of an autumn afternoon. Margaret Daniels carefully placed returned books back on their shelves, listening to the quiet breathing of the patrons around her. For her, the library was the only place where she could find peace of mind. Surrounded by books in this space, she could truly be herself. Sitting at the library counter, Maggie stared at a message on her phone from her sister Victoria. The photo showed a luxurious lunch at an upscale restaurant in New York. New campaign launch. The client is thrilled, read the comment, accompanied by Victoria's radiant smile beaming from the screen. Victoria had made a name for herself in the industry as a marketing manager for a famous fashion brand. Her ambitious and social personality was a source of pride for their parents, George and Caroline. During weekend family phone calls, the conversation always centered around Victoria's latest success stories. Maggie let out a deep sigh. She too was living a fulfilling life in her own way. She had studied library science in college and took pride in her work contributing to the local community. However, at family gatherings, her steady efforts were always pushed into the background. Her father was a successful local real estate developer, and her mother was actively involved in charitable work. They were wealthy and had social standing, wanting to provide their daughters with the best education possible. However, there was a clear bias in how they invested in their children. For Victoria, they arranged and paid for everything: private prestigious schools, study abroad programs, music and dance lessons, and even internships after college graduation. Meanwhile, Maggie was always told, "You're smart enough to figure things out on your own." She graduated from a state university on a scholarship and began working while paying off student loans. Maggie's role in the family was always that of the mediator. Whenever friction arose between her parents and Victoria, when someone was in trouble, it was always Maggie who solved the problems. When their mother had minor heart surgery, it was Maggie who took time off work to care for her. When Victoria was struggling in New York and needed financial assistance, it was Maggie who secretly helped with her own savings. Still, Maggie loved her family. Every time she saw Victoria's glamorous success, she felt complex emotions but was genuinely proud of her sister deep down. Though she felt lonely that her parents prioritized her sister over her, she cherished their family bonds. One rainy October night, Maggie was on her way home from the library when her phone rang. It was a call from the hospital. Her parents' car had lost control on a curve of a mountain road made slippery by rain and had gone off a cliff. By the time the emergency crew arrived, it was already too late. With trembling hands, Maggie hung up the phone and immediately called Victoria. Her sister's crying voice echoed through the phone, and both were left speechless. That night, Maggie went to the hospital alone and stayed with her parents until the end. Victoria rushed back on the first flight from New York the next morning, but during that time, all the procedures and decisions fell to Maggie. Funeral preparations, contacting relatives and friends, settling her father's business affairs, and handling the transition of her mother's charitable organizations. Maggie suppressed her grief and dealt with everything that needed to be done. Victoria was overwhelmed with sorrow and couldn't handle anything, so Maggie supported her sister while bearing the burden alone. The conference room at the law firm Hartwell & Associates was decorated with heavy mahogany furniture and deep green carpeting. Thin light from the cloudy November sky illuminated the long conference table. Maggie sat in a hard chair with her hands folded in her lap. Victoria, sitting beside her, was dressed in a black designer suit and occasionally dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The executor, attorney Robert Hartwell, looked at the documents through his silver-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. Several other relatives sat in the conference room, all waiting in heavy silence. "Now, I will read the last will and testament of Mr. George Daniels and Mrs. Caroline Daniels," Attorney Hartwell's voice broke the silence. "First, regarding the inheritance for Ms. Victoria Daniels." Victoria leaned forward. Maggie noticed her sister's hands trembling slightly. "To Ms. Victoria Daniels, I bequeath the Oceanside Cottage in Ocean City, the penthouse in downtown Philadelphia, the automobile collection including a BMW and Mercedes-Benz, and checking account funds of $850,000 at First Trust Bank, plus investment trusts totaling $420,000. A murmur arose in the conference room. Victoria showed a look of relief, and Aunt Martha whispered, "How wonderful." Maggie sat without changing her expression, but her heart was pounding. Now, regarding the inheritance for Ms. Margaret Daniels, Attorney Hartwell paused for a moment and frowned. To Ms. Margaret Daniels, I bequeath the old barn and its land on the outskirts of Willow Creek, approximately 2 acres. The conference room fell silent. Maggie couldn't believe her ears. A barn. That dilapidated, long-unused old building. She had been there once as a child when her father took her, but no one had been near it since. Victoria was the first to speak. Initially confused, a thin smile gradually appeared on her lips. A barn. An old barn, her voice grew higher. Just as expected, Maggie. Something plain and worthless suits you perfectly. Maggie stared at her sister. Victoria's eyes held a triumphant gleam. I'm sure Mom and Dad thought you just needed a place to store old books, Victoria said coldly. A library suits a librarian. Even if it's a crumbling barn. The relatives awkwardly averted their gazes. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, and Cousin Michael stared at the floor. No one spoke up in Maggie's defense. Is there anything else I inherit? Maggie asked in a trembling voice. Attorney Hartwell checked the documents again. I'm sorry, but that concludes Ms. Margaret's inheritance. He produced an old brass key. This key is believed to be for the barn. And I have this letter for you. A small envelope was handed to Maggie. On the front, to Margaret, was written in her father's handwriting. She received the key and envelope with trembling hands. That concludes the reading of the will. Attorney Hartwell gathered his papers. As they left the conference room, Victoria placed her hand on Maggie's shoulder. Sorry about that. But don't worry. You can always count on me when you need help. After all, you have a rich sister. Her words were filled with false sympathy. Maggie nodded silently and headed to the parking lot alone. Gripping the steering wheel of her old Honda, she opened the letter from her father. The brief message read only, to my beloved daughter. The truth is in the barn. Go alone. A week passed. Maggie tried to return to her daily work routine but couldn't concentrate. Her library colleagues offered kind comfort, but she couldn't tell anyone about the inheritance. Victoria sent daily photos of new furniture and cars with messages saying, the beginning of a new life. Finally, Maggie made up her mind. On Saturday morning, she headed to the barn. The road on the outskirts of Willow Creek was unpaved, and her car rattled along the gravel road. The barn stood on a small hill, surrounded by grass. The building was more dilapidated than she had imagined. The red paint had peeled off, and part of the roof had collapsed. When she opened the heavy door, the smell of dust and mold hit her nose. The dim interior was scattered with old farm tools and broken furniture. Maggie resignedly began cleaning. While sweeping the floor with a broom, she noticed that part of the floorboards in the back looked different from the rest. Looking closely, she could see a new metal plate under the rotted wooden boards. It appeared to have been recently installed. Driven by curiosity, she lifted the boards to reveal a sturdy metal door. The door had a small lock, and Maggie tried the brass key she had received from her father. With a click, the lock opened. Opening the door revealed concrete stairs leading underground. Maggie took the flashlight she had brought from her car and cautiously descended the stairs. After about 15 steps, an unexpectedly vast underground space opened up. The moment she stepped in, automatic sensors activated and fluorescent lights turned on one after another. Maggie gasped. This wasn't just a basement but a space like a secret archive. Bookshelves were installed along the walls, with organized file boxes lined up. In the center was a large desk with an envelope marked, "To Margaret," placed on it. Maggie slowly walked around the room. This underground space hadn't been recently created but showed signs of long-term use. It had proper ventilation equipment and humidity was appropriately maintained. Taking the envelope from the desk, it was much thicker than the previous one. Maggie sat in the chair and opened the seal with trembling hands. The first sentence of the letter written in her father's handwriting would completely change her world. To my beloved daughter Maggie. This place is the true treasure of the Daniels family. Here lies the truth that I can entrust only to you. Maggie continued reading her father's letter. This basement is a place I have been gradually preparing for 10 years. While outwardly disguised as an old tool shed to avoid anyone's attention, it was actually created to store the true records of the Daniels family. Maggie, you have always been the most observant in the family and have an exceptional ability to understand others. That's why I believe only you can accept this truth and make appropriate judgments. Maggie put down the letter and looked around the room again. On the shelves installed on the walls, file boxes were arranged chronologically. Each box was labeled with names like Victoria, Margaret, family records, medical-related, and financial records. She first took out the box labeled a Victoria. It contained several thick files, and when she opened the first file, Victoria's college medical records appeared. Maggie's hands trembled. There were detailed records of hospitalization for eating disorders, counseling records, and meeting records with parents. According to the records, Victoria had developed severe anorexia at age 19. Her perfectionist personality and extremely low self-esteem were the causes. She constantly tried to meet her parents' expectations and became so afraid of failure that she began refusing food. Her weight dropped to dangerous levels, requiring 3 months of hospitalization. Maggie tried to remember that time. Victoria had explained that she was managing her weight for model auditions. The whole family had supported her ambitious plans. No one knew it was a life-threatening illness. The next file contained records from Victoria's job hunting period. She had received job offers from numerous companies, but behind the scenes, there was evidence that their parents had approached university professors and corporate executives on her behalf. Father George had paved the way for his daughter through golf and business dinners with business associates. Mother Caroline had also made full use of the connections she had built through her charitable activities. This support was to compensate for Victoria's mental fragility, read their father's notation. She appeared confident on the surface, but was actually constantly dominated by anxiety and fear. Her fear of failure was so strong that we were afraid she would become ill again. Maggie continued reading while holding back tears. Victoria's current success at work was also actually supported by their parents behind the scenes. Her father had business relationships with several construction companies that were major clients of Victoria's company, indirectly supporting her work. Much of what was called Victoria's talent was actually due to their parents' invisible support. Next, she opened the Margaret file. There were many records she didn't even know about herself. Next to her college scholarship application documents was a draft recommendation letter from her father. My daughter Margaret maintains excellent grades despite financial difficulties and serves as a model for other students, read the text, which surprised Maggie. What surprised her most were the records from when their mother had minor heart surgery. Maggie remembered taking time off work to care for her, but during that time, her father had secretly compensated for her lost wages. There was a record stating, arranged so that Maggie could focus on caring for her mother without financial worries. There were also records about when Victoria was struggling in New York and Maggie had helped her. Maggie thought she had sent $5,000 from her savings, but actually, their father had anonymously sent double that amount to Victoria. It was their father's consideration to ensure that Maggie's kindness wouldn't be wasted and that her assistance would also be meaningful. Margaret's independence and compassion for others were our pride, read their father's notation. She didn't seek material support and always tried to forge her own path. However, as a father, I couldn't suppress my desire to watch over and support her. Maggie opened the iFamily Records file. Their parents' diaries were stored there. Mother Caroline's diary frankly recorded her complex feelings toward her daughters. Victoria appears beautiful and talented, but is actually very delicate and easily hurt. We must constantly provide her with successful experiences to build her confidence. Meanwhile, Maggie has inner strength. Sometimes we may appear to undervalue her, but that's also an expression of our trust in her. We believe Maggie can overcome any difficulty. Their father's diary recorded his business worries. I'm taking utmost care that my intervention in Victoria's job placement isn't discovered. I want her to think she succeeded on her own merit. I feel guilty about hiding the truth from Maggie. However, it's necessary for Victoria's mental stability. The most shocking were the recent diary entries. Records from a month before the accident contained descriptions about the will. I've decided to leave material assets to Victoria. For her, visible success and stability provide emotional support. However, I've decided to entrust the true treasure, the family's truth and responsibility, to Maggie. She will be able to accept this truth and save Victoria. Maggie also opened the medical records file. It recorded that Victoria had recently resumed counseling. Symptoms of anxiety disorder had recurred due to the pressure to succeed and the constant stress of having to meet expectations. However, she hadn't told anyone this fact. The last file contained unsent letters from their father to his daughters. The letter addressed to Victoria read, "Your worth isn't determined by success. We love you for who you are." The letter to Maggie read, "Your strength and kindness are this family's treasure. Please forgive us for relying on you too much." Maggie collapsed on the desk and cried quietly. Their parents weren't perfect, but they loved each daughter and tried to do their best. Behind Victoria's glamorous success lay deep anguish, and Maggie herself had been supported by her parents in ways she never knew. At the end of the letter was their father's final wish. "Maggie, please share this truth with Victoria. She needs to understand that she doesn't need to be perfect and that she has value worthy of love. And you yourself need to know about the contributions and value that haven't been adequately recognized until now. Our greatest wish as parents is for our two daughters to understand each other and live their lives supporting one another." Maggie looked up and surveyed the basement. Here were stored all the family's secrets, love, and complex emotions. The barn, an inheritance that appeared worthless on the surface, was actually the family's most precious treasure. She took out her phone and sent Victoria a short message. "I have something I want to talk to you about. Could you come to the barn with me tomorrow?" The reply came immediately. "The old barn again? What a waste of time. But if you insist so much, I'll humor you." The next afternoon, Maggie was making coffee in her apartment kitchen. She hadn't slept a wink the night before, thinking about the truth she had discovered in the basement. She had pondered many times how to explain it to Victoria. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. It was an hour earlier than the agreed time. When she opened the door, Victoria was standing there. She wasn't in her usual perfect attire but wore jeans with a cashmere sweater, and her makeup was subdued. Looking closely, she had dark circles under her eyes and appeared exhausted. "I came a bit too early," Victoria smiled slightly. "Could we talk a little before going to the barn?" Maggie invited her sister into the living room. When Victoria sat on the sofa, unlike her usual confident demeanor, she was fidgeting with her hands. "Actually, I wanted to apologize to you," Victoria began. "My attitude at the law office was really terrible. I knew you were hurt, but I said such cold things." Maggie was surprised. It was the first time since childhood that she had heard Victoria apologize. "But to be honest," Victoria continued, "I was relieved about the inheritance. I thought I wouldn't have to worry about money. But this past week, I haven't been happy at all. Even in the big house, even driving the luxury car, I feel like something important is missing." Maggie was holding her coffee cup with both hands. "Victoria, there's something I want to talk about before we go to the barn." "Oh, right. So we're going to sell the barn and split the money, right?" Victoria's voice suddenly became bright. "That old building probably isn't worth anything anyway, but the land might be worth something." Maggie shook her head. "That's not possible. I can't explain it without showing you first." The two headed to the barn by car. Victoria drove her new BMW with Maggie in the passenger seat. Light conversation continued in the car, but Maggie's heart was heavy. When they arrived at the barn, Victoria looked up at the building and smiled wryly. "It really is falling apart. Maybe we should tear it down and clear the land." Maggie silently opened the barn door and guided her sister inside. Walking to the entrance to the basement, she pointed to the metal door. "This is what I found yesterday." Victoria looked confused. A basement? Here. Maggie opened the door and descended the stairs first. Victoria hesitantly followed. When the lights came on, Victoria gasped. What is this? A place Dad prepared for years, Maggie explained quietly. All the real records of our family are stored here. Victoria looked around the room, taking in the organized documents and photos. Isn't this invasion of privacy? Why was he investigating us? I thought so at first too. Maggie sat at the central desk. But read this. Maggie handed Victoria her college medical records. Victoria read the first few lines and her face turned pale. This is... Her voice trembled. Why did Dad have this? No one in the family knew about your illness, Maggie said gently. Only Dad and Mom knew and were always worried about you. Victoria collapsed into a chair. At that time, it was really hard. I thought I had to meet everyone's expectations, but I couldn't be perfect. I couldn't eat anymore. Maggie sat beside her sister and held her hand. I'm sorry, I didn't know. If I had known. But I lied to everyone. Victoria's voice became tearful. I said it was weight management to become a model. The truth was, I hated myself and wanted to disappear. Maggie showed her other files. Records of their parents secretly supporting Victoria's job hunting, evidence that her current workplace success was actually due to their parents' connections. Your talent is real, Maggie said. But Dad and Mom were afraid you'd become ill again, so they tried to remove the risk of failure. Victoria continued reading the records while crying. Was all my success fake? That's not true, Maggie strongly denied. Look at this. Maggie opened another file. There were records of Victoria's good deeds that she didn't know about. In high school, she had secretly protected a classmate named Sarah who was being bullied. When Maggie was depressed from a breakup, Victoria had anonymously sent encouraging letters and favorite books. In college, she had used her part-time job money to buy textbooks for financially struggling classmates. Do you remember this too? Maggie showed her a photograph. It was a picture of Victoria volunteering at a local nursing home. When you were 16, you spent 3 years visiting every Saturday to be a companion for elderly people. Without telling anyone. Victoria looked at the photograph and shed new tears. I thought everyone had forgotten. Dad and Mom remembered everything. Your kindness, your compassion, everything is recorded. Maggie read part of Mother Caroline's diary aloud. Victoria appears confident on the surface, but actually has a delicate heart that deeply understands others' pain. Her true beauty lies in the depth of her compassion. Victoria covered her face with both hands. But at the law office, I said such terrible things to my sister. I'm the same. Maggie opened her own file. Dad and Mom also supported me behind the scenes. They showed so much consideration for me in ways I never knew. Maggie explained the hidden support she had received. Scholarship recommendations, salary compensation during her mother's care, her father's additional support for her assistance to Victoria. I was jealous of your success, Maggie admitted. I felt like everyone recognized you and overlooked me. But actually, Dad and Mom loved both of us. They just did it in different ways. Victoria looked up. I always envied your inner strength. You seemed fine on your own, while I couldn't live without someone's approval. I appeared strong because I had to act that way, Maggie smiled. But I really wanted to shine like you. The two looked at each other for a long time. Then they stood up simultaneously and embraced. More than 30 years of misunderstanding and jealousy melted away in that moment. Let's become real sisters from now on, Maggie said, and Victoria nodded while crying. Help me, Victoria whispered. Help me find my true self. Of course, Maggie held her sister tightly. Let's start a new life together. Under the fluorescent lights in the basement, the sisters truly understood each other for the first time. Their parents' love might have been expressed in distorted ways sometimes, but at its foundation was deep love. And their daughters were ready to inherit that love properly. The family photographs hanging on the wall seemed to be watching over them in the soft light, 6 months later in spring, the barn on the hill on the outskirts of Willow Creek had completely transformed. The red exterior walls had been beautifully repainted, and a new sign read, Daniels Memorial Library. Colorful flowers were planted around the building, warmly welcoming visitors. Maggie was at the first-floor reception counter, checking out books for local children. "I'll come again next week, Miss Maggie," 8-year-old Emily waved as she left. In the past 6 months, the library had become a central part of the local community. In the afternoon, Victoria arrived. She wasn't wearing the expensive brand suits of before, but comfortable casual clothing. She carried a bag with materials and smiled peacefully at her sister. "How are the preparations for today's group session?" Maggie asked. 12 participants are expected, Victoria answered brightly. Everyone is becoming more positive about sharing their experiences. After discovering the records in the basement, Victoria had resolved to face herself. She first resumed counseling with a professional therapist, working on the perfectionism and self-esteem issues she had carried for years. 3 months ago, she established the nonprofit, True Radiance Foundation, to support young people struggling with eating disorders and anxiety disorders. She made her past public and began giving lectures about the darkness behind success. Although it required courage at first, she received gratitude from many young people and was able to find true fulfillment. Her attachment to luxury goods naturally disappeared, and she began living a simple but spiritually rich life. In the evening, after the last visitor left, the sisters went down to the basement. This space was still carefully maintained as a place to preserve their parents' records, but it had also been given the new name Room of Hope. The walls were decorated with letters of gratitude from young people who had participated in Victoria's support programs. Maggie continued her work as a librarian while writing a memoir based on her parents' records titled Forms of Love, A Family's Story. The book was scheduled for publication next month, with all royalties to be donated to mental health support organizations. "I wonder what Dad and Mom would think seeing this," Victoria said, looking at the family photograph on the desk. "I think they'd be happy," Maggie smiled. "Because we've become true sisters." The two quietly spoke to their parents' photograph. "Dad, Mom, we finally understand. The real inheritance wasn't money or things, but the heart to care for family and the courage to accept truth." Victoria squeezed her sister's hand. "Thank you for giving me that barn key. It changed my life." "Our lives," Maggie corrected. "From now on, we'll walk together." The evening sun streaming through the window cast warm light on the basement walls. The parents in the photograph seemed to be smiling as they watched their daughter's growth. A year ago, Maggie felt like an overlooked presence in the family. Victoria was chasing superficial success and had lost sight of true happiness. However, the truth hidden in the old barn taught them real bonds and the meaning of life. The two climbed the stairs and locked the first-floor door. Tomorrow, local people would visit with smiles again. As a place where young people facing difficulties could find hope, this library would continue to grow. Maggie and Victoria walked hand in hand down the path enveloped in twilight. Their steps were light, their hearts peaceful. The courage to accept truth had given them the most beautiful new beginning.